The history of economic thought is a story of continuous evolution, shaped by crises, revolutions, and technological leaps. It's also a study of how there can be centuries where almost nothing happened. In this video, I hope to show you how economic thought has developed. From the old idea that the overriding goal was to accumulate pieces of yellow metal, to the more modern view that society grows wealthy by creating and consuming goods and services. We'll also look at the huge developments in our understanding of how, even though there are powerful forces driving markets, they don't always behave the way we expect. But let us start at the beginning. In the ancient and medieval periods, economic thinking was rudimentary, with wealth measured in tangible assets like gold and land. The Romans and medieval kings cared little for the well-being of their peasants, serfs, or slaves. Their power rested on accumulating wealth and controlling territory. The economic activities of the masses were seen as a means to sustain the ruling class, not as a source of society's prosperity. This worldview treated labor as expendable and people as mere tools in the relentless pursuit of wealth and influence. In Rome, despite possessing sophisticated institutions, a legal system, standardized currency, trade networks, and even early technological innovations like rudimentary steam engines and analog calculators, the Romans had little incentive to industrialize. Their economy was built on slave labor, and with a vast supply of conquered peoples to exploit, mechanization offered no advantage. Wealth and power were measured in land and control over human capital, not in productivity or technological progress. Without a pressing need to innovate for efficiency, industrialization never took hold, and economic growth remained stagnant for 1,000 years or more. The mercantilist era marked the first significant shift in economic thought. Emerging in the late medieval period and thriving during the 16th to 18th centuries, mercantilism prioritized national wealth accumulation through trade surpluses and the hoarding of precious metals. Governments actively intervened in the economy, implementing protectionist policies to ensure favorable trade balances. Colonization, monopolies, and strict regulation of commerce were tools in the mercantilist arsenal. The framework still focused on gold and land accumulation as the ultimate measures of national wealth and power, and the accumulated assets were held solely by the ruling classes. The wealth of a nation was equated to the amount of gold and silver it possessed, with trade policies structured to bring in more precious metals while limiting their outflow. Despite mercantilism's fixation on gold, land, and rigid trade policies, something changed in Britain that set the stage for the Industrial Revolution. What exactly triggered this transformation remains unclear. Was it the printing press spreading new ideas, or perhaps the unique geopolitical pressures faced by a resource-limited island nation constantly threatened by invasion? Whatever the catalyst, Britain became the birthplace of a new economic reality, one where wealth was no longer measured in stockpiles of gold, but in productivity, innovation, and industry. This shift laid the groundwork for the classical school of economics, which sought to explain the forces driving this unprecedented economic explosion. Adam Smith, often called the father of modern economics, introduced groundbreaking concepts in his seminal work, The Wealth of Nations. Smith's idea of the invisible hand suggested that individual self-interest could benefit society through a natural order of market forces without the need for heavy government intervention. This principle explained the economic growth unleashed by the Industrial Revolution, where innovation, competition, and specialization flourished. Unlike the mercantilist's obsession with accumulating gold, Smith saw wealth as arising from the production of goods and services. Smith's famous example of the pin factory illustrated how the division of labor increased productivity by breaking tasks into smaller, specialized functions. This specialization has continued into modern practices today, where workers often focus on narrow career paths or production line jobs that are highly efficient but sometimes limiting in scope. This idea also extended to international trade through the theory of comparative advantage. As developed by David Ricardo, comparative advantage challenged the intuitive notion that countries should only produce what they are best at. Instead, it showed that even if one country is better at producing everything, both can still benefit from trade by specializing in the goods they produce most efficiently. The classical school championed free markets, free trade, and minimal regulation, believing that competition and the free exchange of goods would lead to optimal outcomes. But this optimistic view overlooked the harsh realities of industrial capitalism: child labor, poor working conditions, and exploitation. As a result, the Marxist school, headed up by Karl Marx, emerged in the 19th century as a critique of capitalism. Marx observed the appalling working conditions in factories and argued that capitalism inherently exploited labour. He asserted that the value of goods was derived from the labour embedded in them, and that capitalists, by owning the means of production, appropriated the surplus value created by workers. This dynamic, Marx argued, led to inequality and class conflict. Marx predicted that capitalism's contradictions would eventually lead to its collapse and be replaced by a system of public ownership and control. While Marx's vision of a proletarian revolution did not materialize as he envisioned, his critique highlighted genuine flaws in early capitalism. Over time, capitalism evolved, incorporating reforms such as labor protections, progressive taxation, public education, and bans on child labor. These reforms were, in a sense, a more subtle revolution. Marx's views on exploitation have also found echoes in anti-colonial movements, civil rights struggles, and modern populist movements that continue to challenge inequality. However, while some of his ideas were visionary, many of his policy prescriptions, such as the abolition of private property and state control over key industries, proved disastrous when implemented, as seen in the economic failures of Soviet-style socialism. As the 19th century progressed, neoclassical economists shifted the focus from broad market forces to individual decision-making and the allocation of scarce resources. This school developed supply and demand curves, marginal analysis, and utility theory, making economics more rigorous and predictive. Neoclassical theory emphasized the idea of market equilibrium, where prices adjusted to balance supply and demand, reaffirming the classical belief in the efficiency of markets. Neoclassical economics also responded to Marx's concerns about labor exploitation. Rather than viewing low wages as theft, it explained that wages depended on supply and demand. In the same way as water is essential but often free due to abundance, so too is labor cheap when plentiful. This wasn't exploitation, but market forces at work. For example, if a kind-hearted employer paid higher wages than the market, then his costs would rise, his customers would go elsewhere, and the business would fail. So it wasn't theft that caused low wages, it was competition and the abundant availability of labor. So what could be done? The answer would have to be to somehow restrict the supply of labor. And that is what labor unions did. It is true they also fought for better conditions and rights, but it was their ability to restrict supply by demanding that only union members could be hired that led to improved wages. This was essential in order to level the playing field between powerful factory owners and abundant labor. The Great Depression of the 1930s challenged the foundations of classical and neoclassical economics. The belief that markets were self-correcting and inherently stable was called into question as economies around the world plunged into prolonged stagnation. John Maynard Keynes emerged as a revolutionary thinker, arguing that government intervention was necessary to stabilize economies during downturns. Keynes introduced the concept of sticky wages and prices, which explained why markets might fail to clear and why unemployment could persist. Keynes emphasized the role of aggregate demand in driving economic activity. Unlike earlier schools, which viewed labor primarily as a cost, Keynes saw labor as a source of demand. When people were employed, they had income to spend, creating a virtuous cycle of economic growth. He saw recessions as self-reinforcing. Falling demand led to wage cuts, causing further reductions in spending and deepening the downturn. Government intervention was necessary to break this cycle. Following World War II, Keynesian economics became the dominant framework for economic policymaking. Governments across the Western world embraced deficit spending and active fiscal policies to maintain full employment and stabilize economic fluctuations. The so-called golden age of capitalism saw unprecedented economic growth, rising living standards, and expanding welfare states, all underpinned by Keynesian principles. Policies such as the GI Bill in the US, Social Security expansion, and infrastructure investments reinforced the idea that government action could smooth out business cycles and ensure prosperity. However, in practice, Keynesian economics led to ever-expanding government involvement, even in good times, contributing to inflationary pressures. By the 1970s, stagflation, that's high inflation with unemployment, exposed flaws in Keynesian thinking. Monetarism, led by Milton Friedman, rose as an alternative. Friedman argued that monetary policy, rather than fiscal policy, was the key to managing economic fluctuations. He famously stated that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, attributing it to excessive growth in the money supply. Friedman's research, particularly his work with Anna Schwartz in A Monetary History of the United States, demonstrated the Federal Reserve's role in exacerbating the Great Depression through poor monetary policy. Friedman advocated for a rules-based approach to monetary policy, such as targeting a steady growth rate of the money supply. His ideas influenced leaders like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, who implemented policies emphasizing monetary stability and limited government intervention. However, monetarism had its own problems. One key issue was the instability of money demand. Central banks struggled to control inflation simply by targeting money supply growth because the velocity of money, the rate at which money circulates in the economy, was not constant. This became particularly evident in the 1980s, when attempts to target money supply growth led to erratic interest rates and financial instability. Another challenge was that monetarist policies often prioritized inflation control over employment and economic growth, leading to painful recessions, such as the Volcker-induced downturn in the early 1980s. These shortcomings eventually led to the rise of more flexible approaches, such as inflation targeting and new Keynesian economics, which incorporated elements of both monetary and fiscal policy. Today's prevailing economic consensus is a fusion of different schools of thought, reflecting the complexities of modern economies. The mixed economy model balances market mechanisms with government intervention. Specialization, trade, and globalization have driven efficiency, providing cheaper goods and services for many. Independent central banks prioritize price stability, using monetary policy to manage inflation and economic fluctuations. Meanwhile, governments deploy fiscal stabilizers, such as unemployment benefits and stimulus measures, to cushion economic downturns. This framework has proven resilient, weathering major crises like the Great Recession and the COVID-19 pandemic. We should note that the future remains uncertain, but it is full of opportunities as well as risks. And from an economics perspective, it's quite exciting. Economics is still a young science and evolving rapidly. There have been huge developments in our understanding of how markets work, and going forward that looks set to continue as our understanding advances in the exciting fields of chaos theory, behavioral economics, and many others. And the battle between the interventionist and non-interventionist wings of economics looks set to continue or even intensify with the new ideas evolving in modern monetary theory. I expect to post a video on that subject in the very near future. A link should be showing on your screens now. Just click to keep watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, then please like, subscribe, and comment. Thanks for watching.